Welcome to the second session in our continuing series on the Third Commandment as part of cell evangelization here at Transfiguration. It's a pleasure and joy to be with all of you again as we develop a deeper and greater appreciation for the gift of a day of rest that comes to us from God. In our first session, we focused on the scriptural testimony, which helped us to place an understanding of the Sabbath as a gift from God and a part of His plan for creation, and a way that we can participate more fully in His plan for our lives. For this session, we're going to look at a little bit of the historical development of how people have observed the Third Commandment in a relationship with the living God. Now, it should be noted that we can see a tiny bit of a tease about this in the New Testament itself. In the Acts of the Apostles, we hear about how most of the early Christians are themselves Jewish. And it's later in the missionary work of the church that Gentiles throughout the Roman Empire will become disciples of Christ. The practical application of this in terms of the Third Commandment is that it means that in the early decades of the church, pretty much any Christian would have observed the Third Commandment exactly the way a Jewish person would have, which means that we held to the Sabbath day. The Third Commandment, the day of rest, in which we are to honor the Lord and refrain from our own busyness and our own priorities, was still held on a Saturday. And all of the laws that applied to a Jewish person would have been thought to apply to a Christian. But this became a little bit of a controversy, not just on the issue of the Sabbath, but a whole wide variety of other issues, particularly dietary issues, when it came to the Christian and the Jewish practices. For the Christians who were actually Jewish, there was no sense of conflict between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But for the Christians who had been baptized from a pagan background, there was a whole wide variety of things that they had never practiced and thus weren't certain whether it was required to be a part of being a disciple of Jesus Christ. This led to a controversy that's described in the Acts of the Apostles that we now know as the Judaizer controversy. This consisted of two distinct groups of people. On one hand, there was the Judaizers, who were arguing that in order to be a Christian, one would have to first become Jewish, accepting all of the customs, the heritage, the legal framework of Judaism in order to then be a disciple of the Lord. On the other hand, there was another group, represented most forcefully by St. Paul, that said no, Jesus Christ, in His passion, His death and resurrection, had fulfilled the law, and the law no longer was the preeminent authority, and instead it was our faith and our works that would lead us to our Lord Jesus Christ. This then meant that certain practices would no longer be required of a disciple. Now, this didn't immediately impact the questions of the Third Commandment, because when they met in what's called the Council of Jerusalem, they were focused more on other issues. Nonetheless, it did have eventually applications of thinking that would manifest themselves in the practice around the Third Commandment. Following those initial decades of Christian worship in a totally Jewish mindset, the second century saw a much more Gentile mindset begin to impact Christian worship and living. It was in this world where St. Ignatius of Antioch, one of the great doctors of the church and a wonderful bishop who led his diocese heroically, even to the point of offering his own life, began to relax and even eventually to do away with the Sabbath law in his own diocese. This was inspired by the work that we had seen in the letters of St. Paul and the fact that we saw in the Acts of the Apostles. The Judaizer controversy settled with a definitive answer that Gentiles did not need to adopt all of the practices and customs of the Jewish people. When this came to the question of the Saturday, thus they no longer needed to follow that and would be free instead to make their day of rest on Sunday, the Lord's Day. With the Christian practice of moving the observance of the Third Commandment to Sunday instead of Saturday came a wide variety of other developments in the thinking around what it meant to hold to the Third Commandment. A variety of different thinkers over the course of several centuries were trying to figure out what was the best way to utilize this day of rest as a way of helping people to draw closer to God. In fact, they were not actually interested at first on the idea of rest itself, but rather communal worship. For the early Christians, this was a key part of how they sustained themselves. During periods of persecution, it was their ability to gather together, often in secret, that enabled them to persevere and hold to the faith as they would individually suffer trial and have to maintain their faith while navigating a hostile world. Once the Roman Emperor Constantine converted, this began to abate, and it was actually Constantine who made a civil law decreeing in the 300s that Sunday would now become a day of rest from labor. The church's own law never actually made any such change, but they welcomed this because it enabled those Christians living in that century to easily get to Mass and to develop the community that was meant for Christian living. A key part of how Christians have meant to understand the Third Commandment is about coming together in order to know who God is. This is reflective of our understanding of the church as the body of Christ. We observe the Third Commandment as not just an individual, but a part of the church. As in fact, one of the great reasons why Ignatius was so hostile to the understanding of the Sabbath and was willing to actually open up and change the law entirely so that it was no longer observed on Saturdays is because he considered much of the way it was being observed to be license for sloth. People would do nothing. They would sit around and make it a point to do absolutely nothing of significance and no actual work, even to the point that they weren't actually fulfilling the commandments of charity. And so by doing away with that framework and building up a new one, it would allow them to be more participatory in the life of the church and to build up the communion of faith that was bequeathed to them. By the Middle Ages, writers like St. Thomas of Aquinas had come to realize that the way in which we would look at the Sabbath and the Old Law was not so much about the actual marking of a calendar, but rather of morality itself. Thomas Aquinas focused at great length about this in his argumentation for why Sunday should be observed as the day of rest. But he never looked at it as a way in which to get out of work. St. Thomas Aquinas, building upon the tradition of faith that had been taught by St. Augustine centuries before him, looked at the Sabbath day, at the day of rest, as being an opportunity to be able to more perfectly observe the new creation that had been brought by the resurrection. And so in the Middle Ages, a wide variety of liturgical functions began to develop in the understanding of the Sabbath day on the Lord's Day of Sunday. In following the Third Commandment, the church has always seen a liturgical component as being a necessary part of this. At the heart of that, of course, is the Sunday obligation to attend Mass, and even to make it a point at least once a year to receive Holy Communion. This is what's known as the Easter duty, where Catholics are all required under law to make a Holy Communion in a state of grace sometime during the Easter season. And that, of course, gave rise to the practice of making a point to go to confession at least one time a year, typically during Lent. Of course, we know the Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith, so we don't want to limit ourselves to just that bare minimum of receiving communion once a year. And the Church has made it more and more accessible for us to receive the Eucharist as a way of helping us to appreciate that aspect of the Third Commandment. We used to have an actual practice of abstaining from all food from midnight all the way up until one would receive the Eucharist. But in the reforms that came from Vatican II, this began to be relaxed to just an hour in which we would have a little bit of a fast to prepare ourselves for the Eucharist, while also having a greater likelihood that more people would receive communion without having to endure such a difficult fast and choosing to eat breakfast instead. Now, as we look at the Holy Eucharist as a part of the liturgy, we also know it exists within a larger context of liturgical celebration. Many parishes still to this day will have solemn vespers, oftentimes accompanied by Eucharistic adoration and benediction, that allow people to partake in the continuation of the Eucharistic mystery that is seen at Mass. But this also isn't something we need to even necessarily do in the presence of the Church and with the Eucharist right before us. The Liturgy of the Hours is also a part of how we recognize the holy day of obligation, whether it's on a Sunday or another day designated by the Church. When we come to celebrate the Liturgy of the Hours, we adopt an older understanding of time that comes to us from our Jewish heritage. The Jewish people still to this day, in at least a religious sense, understand nightfall to be the start of the day. This goes back to their appreciation for the work God did in the Exodus as He, in the final plague, set them in a path towards their own freedom. Just as the Jewish people understood that night, that sacred night in which the Lord finally set them free through the final plague, as a time for prayer and preparation, so too can we use our Saturday evening in the same way. It's that understanding of the idea of the day beginning at nightfall that allows us to have an anticipatory Mass on Saturday evenings that can count towards our Sunday obligation, for example. And we can say that we even begin the Third Commandment and the day of rest when we go to that particular Mass. Or perhaps we're not somebody who likes to go to Mass on Saturday. We can still think of that Sabbath day or that holy day beginning on the evening of Saturday by looking at the Liturgy of the Hours. Perhaps somebody who doesn't like to go to Mass on Saturday evenings and instead always likes to go on Sunday mornings. That's perfectly fine, and it doesn't mean that someone can't actually begin liturgically celebrating the Third Commandment and the day of rest on a Saturday night, because the Liturgy of the Hours also allows us to tap into the Lord's Day on Saturday evening. The great German philosopher Josef Pieper spoke eloquently about the importance of leisure as a basis for culture. The Christian Church has always recognized and appreciated that we need leisure, because without it, we can't really appreciate the finer things of life. In Pieper's work on the subject, he highlighted the fact that if we really want to have a thriving civilization, if we want to be able to appreciate the greater things of life and to truly understand who we are, we can't simply be about work all the time. That life is more than a matter of function. It is about how we can appreciate beauty, truth, and goodness. Leisure allows us to do these things. And thus, as we look at how the Church has understood Sunday as part of the Third Commandment, the essence of leisure is always there. But leisure not for our own idleness, but rather for the sake of being able to appreciate and know God's creation. That's why, unlike in, say, the Old Testament understanding and the most strict observance of the Sabbath law that we would have found in Pharisaic Judaism, we are able to go out and do things on a Sabbath. We can actually observe the holy day. We can keep the Third Commandment while taking a hike, while being able to go out and play in a yard, while building up some kind of fun activity, engaging in a hobby, and appreciating the ways in which we see God at work in His creation. A major part of how we can help to retrieve a fuller appreciation of God as a creator is to use the Third Commandment, the Lord's Day, as a way in which we are able to see and recognize true leisure and take part in the work that God does.